Hey everyone, welcome to The New Populist. I'm Dave Brown. If you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe. I have a very interesting video today, and this is concerning the new study from the CDC that conservatives pounced on as showing that natural immunity was superior to vaccine immunity. Now, the funny thing is, the CDC is actually trying to prove the opposite. And if you actually go into their data, natural immunity is actually proven to be much more robust than vaccine immunity. But people were focusing on the part where it said that when the Delta strain was introduced, that natural immunity hung in there better than vaccine immunity. And that is certainly true. But when you dig a little deeper, the stats actually show a much better case for natural immunity overall. And it kind of shows you how you can juke stats to give any impression you want. And so when you read these studies, you really have to look carefully at what they're saying and find those little holes, those little inconsistencies that actually show that they're trying to not necessarily mislead, but they're giving a kind of a false impression of what's going on here. So let's go through the study, and I'm going to pick out a few parts where they talk about the strength of vaccine immunity, and then show you where they kind of aren't being 100% straight with the numbers. So from the discussion from the study, it says, case rates were initially lowest among vaccinated persons without a previous COVID-19 diagnosis. However, after emergence of the Delta variant and over the course of time, incidence increased sharply in this group, but only slightly among both vaccinated and unvaccinated persons with previously diagnosed COVID-19. Across the entire study period, persons with vaccine and infection-derived immunity had much lower rates of hospitalization compared with those in unvaccinated persons. These results suggest that vaccination protects against COVID-19 and related hospitalization, and that surviving a previous infection protects against a reinfection. Importantly, infection-derived protection was greater after the highly transmissible Delta variant became predominant, coinciding with early declining of vaccine-induced immunity in many persons. Similar data accounting for booster doses, and as new variants, including Omicron, circulate, will need to be accessed. So they're admitting that people with natural immunity had more robust immunity when Delta occurred, but they're trying to say that it coincided with the declining of vaccine-induced immunity, so that in the beginning, vaccine immunity was better, but then it started to decline, and when Delta hit, that's when natural immunity sort of hung in there better. So they're not trying to say that natural immunity is better, they're saying the vaccines were wearing off. But what they're not telling you, and what I find interesting, is that they're comparing people who got COVID-19 almost a year and a half ago to people who were much more recently vaccinated. And I put together this graph here to sort of illustrate that. Let me pull it up. So the first case of COVID-19 was detected in January 2020 in Washington. And for almost a full year, people were getting infected because there were no vaccines and because, well, they were getting infected anyway. And then vaccines or vaccination was started in December 2020. And so we have this, again, this full year, and then vaccines start. And this study starts in May of 2021. So they're looking at people who were infected between May 2021 and November of 2021. But instead of saying, okay, let's compare people who were infected at the same time people were being vaccinated to compare the strength of vaccines versus the natural immunity over that same period of time, they were including anybody who was infected almost a year and a half ago. Now, I would love to see what would happen if they actually made that control and actually only included people who were infected after December 2020. They would show, I guarantee you, much different numbers because according to the study, and let me pull this up, and this is where they give how much better protection vaccine immunity gave you. It says during the week beginning May 30th, 2021, compared with COVID-19 case rates among unvaccinated persons without a previous COVID-19 diagnosis. COVID-19 case rates were 19.9-fold and 18.4-fold lower among vaccinated persons without a previous diagnosis versus rates being 7.2 and 9.9-fold lower among unvaccinated persons with a previous COVID-19 diagnosis. So here they're saying, see, look, people who were vaccinated initially had much lower incidences of getting COVID-19 versus people who were previously infected. But again, they're comparing people who were infected almost a year and a half ago to people who were just recently vaccinated. And if you look at their figures here, let me pull up this chart. And this is where it really shows you the, I won't say dishonesty, but misrepresenting. Okay, so what this chart shows you is, on average, when infection occurred after vaccination and after natural infection. And in California, on average, somebody who was vaccinated with no previous COVID-19 diagnosis, on average, they were infected 150 days later. Versus people who had a previous COVID-19 diagnosis and who were unvaccinated, on average, they were infected 277 days later. And the range is between 229 up to 356 days later, almost a full year later. So right there, we're seeing that these infections are happening way past when people are being infected who had vaccine-induced immunity. And that's in California. And New York shows a very similar thing. Somebody who was vaccinated with no previous diagnosis, on average, was infected 171 days later versus people who were unvaccinated but had that previous COVID-19 diagnosis were infected 295 days later on average, and the reinfections were between 242 days and 427 days. So again, if you were to compare people who had a natural infection after December 2020, when vaccines were introduced, and we're comparing those people, those natural infections, with people who had that vaccine-induced immunity, I wonder what the data would show. Would you get that 19.5-fold lower versus only 9.5-fold lower for the previously infected? They don't want to show you that data because I guarantee you that data would show that the natural immunity was much more robust. Now, one other thing I thought was interesting was, and this is where, again, something's going on here, and unless we have more information, we really can't figure it out. But one thing it said was that people who had a previous COVID-19 infection and were vaccinated also had a higher rate of reinfection than just the vaccinated group. Now, of course, you've heard the term super immunity, where somebody who has vaccination and a previous COVID-19 diagnosis is supposed to have the super immunity, but their own numbers don't show this. Now, again, we need more information to figure out what's going on here, but that kind of breaks down this idea that getting vaccinated on top of your natural infection confers some sort of super benefit, because according to their figures, again, they're not my figures, they're their figures, it doesn't do that. And people with a previous infection and vaccination, again, they were 9.6-fold and 8.5-fold lower rates of reinfection versus the unvaccinated. But again, that's a lot less than the people who were 18.4-fold lower rates of infection. So something doesn't jive here. And again, when it comes to statistics, you can sort of give yourself or show yourself anything you want to show. And that's why you have to be very careful when interpreting data and putting together stats to either prove your case or not prove your case. You can really prove anything you want to prove. But one thing I thought was interesting, they talk about the rate of hospitalization for people who are either have a vaccine or natural immunity. And if you look at their charts, and this is their hazard case, estimated hazard rate, people who have the vaccine or have the natural immunity have very, very low rates of hospitalization. And ultimately, that's the important thing. If you're vaccinated or if you have natural immunity because you were infected, you might get infected again. And especially with Omicron, I was reinfected with Omicron 18 months after my first bout with COVID-19. And if the first bout I had with COVID-19 was a 10 as far as severity, Omicron was a 1. And so having the vaccine or having natural immunity, you're going to get reinfected again. COVID-19 will become endemic, but with those natural antibodies, you're going to have a much more mild case. And again, there is no escape from getting sick, from getting flus, from getting colds, and from getting future variants of COVID-19, which are hopefully progressively get weaker and weaker. And that's the pattern we're seeing right now. So our goal shouldn't be eradication of COVID-19. It should be to get to the point where people who are healthy, who've had a previous infection, who are vaccinated, are safe from hospitalization and from getting very, very sick. And if our goal is to use vaccines to eradicate COVID-19, which they can't, we're essentially saying, well, if they wane after 5 months, that means we need booster shots every 6 months in perpetuity. Do you want to take 20, 30, 40, 50 mRNA vaccines the rest of your life? Or do you just want to live healthy, lose weight, eat right, and have your natural immunity? And so if you encounter the virus, either you don't get it, or if you do get it, it's like a seasonal cold, which we're all going to get anyway, because that's life, and life is not perfect. You're going to get sick. So again, CDC study was meant to show that vaccine was actually stronger than natural immunity, but their numbers actually prove the opposite, ironically enough. And it's time for the CDC to be honest. It's time for us to end this pandemic and move on with our lives. We can't control it. Everybody's going to get sick, and that is the reality. But government never likes to tell you that they don't have a solution. They always have to give you a solution, even if it's a terrible one. And unfortunately, we've all found out this last 2 years that their solution was a terrible one and made things a lot worse. That's it for now. I hope this was interesting for you. It was interesting for me to go through this data and to see what it really said. And for us who touted natural immunity, I think this actually made our case. So again, if you are new to this channel, please like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.